Welcome to the Exploress. Time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. We walk into a rural village and into the hut of a very special woman. She is blind, with jet black hair, and we are here for something only she can give. She kneels before us on the straw-matted floor, unwraps a box, opens its lid, and takes out a bow. She notches an arrow and salutes to the east and west. Then she places a small bowl of water containing a shikimi leaf on a tray as an offering to the gods, or kami. She strikes the bowstring with a stick of bamboo, closes her eyes, and enters a trance-like state. She is an itaco, a Shinto shaman who can speak to the dead. We take the shikimi leaf from the bowl, add some water, and stir it 3 times in a counterclockwise direction. When the itaco begins to speak in a low, hypnotic voice, we know the seance has officially begun. Hold up, where are we exactly? We've time-traveled back to the early 1700s. The United States is still just 13 British colonies. Much of South America has been carved up by the Spanish and Portuguese, and 2/3 of the enslaved people being transported to the Americas via the transatlantic slave trade are being stolen from West Africa. Queen Anne is on the throne in England. Louis XIV is happily waging war from his newly built palace at Versailles. And in Russia, Peter the Great has just established a new city called St. Petersburg. None of these rulers or their countrymen have ever visited these mysterious, isolated islands halfway across the world, called Japan. This country has been closed to foreigners for about 100 years at this point, since the Tokugawa family came to power in 1603. This is a place and a time shrouded in mystery. How much do we know about what life was like for the ladies in Tokugawa Japan? Grab some tea and your favorite kimono, because we're about to find out. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My newest pirate queen, Phyllis. My newest lady presidents, Kara and Ashling. My newest boss ladies, Julia and Erin. My warrior queens, Alexis, Amanda, Ika, Jessica, June, Neve, and Sloan, Kate, Samantha, and Sarah. My imperial empresses, Letitia, Alyssa, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, Katie, Samara, and Teresa. And my lady pharaohs, Cheryl, Kot, Kate, Kimberly, Laura, Lori, Sophie, and the fabulous Courtneys. This show wouldn't be possible without the generous support of all my patrons. For just a few dollars a month, they get each episode early and ad-free, access to giveaways, discounts on merch, full interviews with guests, and, of course, exclusive bonus episodes. I've just published one on Tomoe Gozen, a Japanese warrior of legend that would pair quite nicely with today's episode. To find it, just go to my website, theexploresspodcast.com. One more thing before we get started. My 1920s tinted fantasy novel, NIGHTBIRDS, comes out in paperback in June, and I'd love it if you'd pick up a copy. If you love the Exploress and you like a good adventure, then I think it might just be your cup of tea. To celebrate the paperback's release, I'll be doing a read-along and recap series over on my other podcast, Pub Dates. Whether you're rereading NIGHTBIRDS in preparation for the sequel coming out, or reading it for the first time, I hope you'll join me. Speaking of the sequel, Firebirds is coming out on August 27th, and it would mean the world to me if you'd pre-order yourself a copy. Every purchase of one of my novels makes a huge difference when it comes to supporting my work. You'll find links to both books in the show notes. Now, on with the show. Before we get into the day-in-the-life nitty-gritty for the ladies, we need to hover over this time and place and lay down some scaffolding. Scholars often refer to the years of Tokugawa rule as the Edo period of Japanese history. The city of Edo, now modern-day Tokyo, is where the Tokugawa family's castle is situated, and it is their seat of power. Throughout the 1500s, Japan had seen a series of civil wars as the daimyo, or military lords, fought each other for power. Eventually, Tokugawa Ieyasu and his coalition of daimyo claimed victory, and the emperor formally appointed him shogun, an ancient title of a very long expression that translates roughly to commander-in-chief for quelling the barbarians. The shogun acts as a military dictator. He is the supreme military and political commander, so really the de facto head of state. He and his government get their power from the divine emperor, who nominates them to rule, or so they say. And this is technically true. The emperor is supreme ruler, and everyone around him acts only with his favor. But he serves as more of a religious figurehead in this period. Think of him as being like the Pope to the shogun's Holy Roman Emperor. The Tokugawa shogunate brings peace and stability to Japan, and their rule spans from 1603 to 1868. How do the Tokugawas successfully rule over a country that's been divided by war for almost a century? To find out, we need to look more closely at how they structure their society and how they keep everyone under their thumb. The first thing the shogun does when he takes power is kick out all foreigners and institute a policy of seclusion from the outside world. This move goes hand in hand with banning Christianity, because many of these foreigners are Portuguese missionaries. Before 1603, Japan was open to trade and visitors, but that all comes to a screeching halt under the Tokugawas. The shogun also prohibits Japanese citizens from leaving the country. All citizens living overseas are effectively cut off from their homeland. The Japanese aren't even allowed to build ocean-going ships. Soon, the only contact with the outside world comes from Dutch and Chinese trading stations in Nagasaki, which are heavily supervised, and it's through those traders that the shogun receives reports about the goings-on elsewhere. What's the deal with this sudden curtain of isolation? Well, first, the Tokugawa family fear that foreigners might team up with those rival military lords, the daimyos, and support rebellions. And they believe it will be easier to keep the peace and control the populace without outsiders getting all up in their business. This idea largely proves correct. During the Edo period, while Japan is at peace, France is at war for 115 years. Great Britain for 125, Spain for a whopping 160, you get the idea. By the end of the period, Japan will have become one of the most urbanized countries in the world, having experienced massive economic and population growth, which leads to a blossoming of culture. High literacy rates, kabuki theater, sumo wrestling, woodblock print books, and the famous tea ceremony. All of these staples of Japanese culture become popular under the Tokugawas. Gee, boys, look how well things can go when you choose not to fight wars all the time. Isolating the country isn't the only way the shogun maintains control, though. The Tokugawa family is quite powerful, but they only hold about 30% of Japanese land. The rest is held by over 250 daimyo families. If you're having trouble remembering who the daimyo are, just think of them as nobles with armies, which might prove problematic if they decide to join forces and gang up against you. So the shogun institutes a clever system that gives the daimyo the freedom to continue controlling their lands, while still ultimately pledging fealty to the Tokugawas. To dilute their power, the size of each daimyo's army is restricted. Lords are encouraged to spy on each other, government inspectors get in on this as well, and Tokugawa allies are given castles in strategic strongholds around Edo. Want to make friends? Just gift them a castle. The shogun also takes control of all the gold and silver mines, as well as minting currency and creating and controlling the national highway system. The most important way he keeps control, though? He takes hostages. All daimyo are required to spend every other year living at Edo Castle with the shogun, and their families are forced to live in Edo permanently, at residences maintained by the lords. They are living in relative comfort, to be sure, but make no mistake, they're essentially prisoners. It's kind of a keep your friends close and your potential enemies closer situation. Even if you're an angry and embittered lord, starting a rebellion is pretty much out of the question, seeing as your wife and kids are currently living within grabbing distance of the shogun. The Tokugawa shogunate rely on a rigid class system to control society and keep everyone in line. The idea for it comes from Neo-Confucianism, which forms the basis of Chinese imperial rule. It's a hereditary four-class system. At the top of this system is the warrior class, or the samurai. Now, before you start picturing beefy warriors with giant swords, know that all the people in this class, men, women, and children, would have been referred to as samurai. At the beginning of the Edo period, most of these guys are actual warriors, having fought in the recent civil wars. But as time goes on, many become government officials or civil administrators. After all, there aren't really any more wars to fight. Even though loyalty to the shogun has become more about pushing papers than dying on the battlefield, many of their warrior traditions are kept alive, and legal codes still urge the samurai to train. Let's talk about swords for a second. Because while the samurai are encouraged to keep up their stabby skills, their right to actually use their weapons is super restricted by the legal code, in order to keep the peace. During the Edo period, carrying a sword is more a status symbol than anything. The number and kinds of swords you can wear as an accessory say a lot about your social position. See, people from the samurai class are the only ones allowed to carry two swords, one long, one short. Some people from other classes are allowed to carry small swords for protection, but most citizens are forced to give them up to prevent rebellion. If you're thinking about flouting the law and wearing your giant cutlass anyway, you should know that this rule is one that's actually enforced. At one point, an actual sword hunt takes place, where government officials hunt down farmers and merchants and confiscate weapons from the peasantry. But it's all okay, according to the 8th shogun, who wrote,
"It is worthy of celebration that bows and arrows are kept in bags and swords in wooden cases. That the shogun's men keep their armor in merchant storehouses means that Japan is now enjoying unprecedented peace. You should not be sorrowful that swords and bows rot in pawn shops."
Yeah, okay, but can I have my sword back? Being samurai is a matter of heredity. In Japan, you can't just wake up one bright morning and decide to pursue your secret dream of becoming a professional underwater basket weaver. People are born into their class, and legally, they must stay there. The social order is essentially frozen in place. The daimyo, or noble lords we met before, are all of the samurai class, but that's not to say that all samurais are daimyo. Daimyo, remember, are military lords with their own castles, lands, and armies. There are a lot of samurai who simply live in the cities and serve in the court or the shogun's army. Even though the samurai are all basically nobility, there are a lot of things that they aren't allowed to do. They can't go into the countryside, interact with peasants, or start a business or a farm. All samurai live in the small cities and towns that have sprung up around the castles of the daimyo and the shogun, and they have to get official permission to travel outside them. As a result, about 10% of the Japanese population live in urban areas, as merchants and artisans flock to these cities to sell things to the samurai. Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto prove to be the biggest. Some 5 to 7% of the Japanese live in large cities, compared to 2% of people in Europe at this time. For all their lofty social positioning, samurai also aren't making much money. Most of them get paid not in gold, but in rice. Without anyone to fight, they're often bored, but also broke, especially if they're lower ranking. Some of these are almost like wandering knights, hitting the road in search of employment. As the period goes on, more and more of them start borrowing money from one of the lowest, most reviled classes, merchants. After all, you can't eat status. The samurai are supposed to be society's role models, which means they are expected to act with dignity and decorum, and to live moral and sober lives. They also live in constant fear that commoners will rise above their station, and they are often arrogant about their privileges, such as the fact that they're the only class with two names: a family name, which comes first when you introduce yourself, and a personal one. The samurai are also the most educated class. Their children attend special schools, and while boys' education focuses more on ethics, classics, language, etiquette, calligraphy, and weaponry, girls are often taught at home by the women around them, where they learn housekeeping, reading, calligraphy, tea ceremony, music, and flower arrangement. As we know, most samurai women live in cities, and if you're the wife of someone important, you are probably living in Edo as a hostage. Honored guest. Some women also have the honor of serving in the shogun's court, or they might even become one of his concubines. They live the lives of privileged courtiers, navigating a treacherous social hierarchy, and some of them are being trained to fight to protect the shogun. High-ranking women bodyguards, you say? Intriguing. But let's save them for a future episode. The second ranking class also comprises the bulk of the population: farmers. Most of them produce rice, although as the demand for goods increases, they also begin growing cash crops such as vegetables, cotton, tobacco, and hemp. Many farmers live a difficult life. As we know, they are forbidden to carry weapons, and they're also forbidden from leaving their land. By law, they can't abandon their fields to try and make more money elsewhere, because the samurai depend on them for rice. Rice is so important in Japanese society that income isn't calculated in money, but in rice, and land isn't measured by area, but by the estimated amount of rice it would produce in a year. The shogun himself oversees rice distribution for the country. Farmers are heavily taxed by their daimyos, who usually take about 40 to 60% of their crop to feed the samurai. And if crops fail that year, you can't just move to town and start a new business. They do take on side hustles now and then, like making sake, but many farmers are constantly pressed for cash. Many get into such dire financial straits that they are forced to sell their daughters to the entertainment districts in the cities, where they become actresses, sex workers, and geisha, whom we'll talk about a lot more later. The daimyos and government officials who try to control the farmers aren't too good at reading the room when it comes to making laws. One village ordinance issued in 1649 declared,
Peasants are people without sense or forethought. Therefore, they must not give rice to their wives and children at harvest time, but must save food for the future. They should eat millet, vegetables, and other coarse food instead of rice. The husband must work in the fields, the wife must work at the loom. Both must do night work. However good-looking a wife may be, if she neglects her household duties by drinking tea or sightseeing or rambling on the hillsides, she must be divorced.
Drinking tea, sightseeing, and rambling on hillsides? Too bad Miss Elizabeth Bennet never visited Japan. Are the farmers actually obeying these ludicrous rules? Most certainly not. But they do have to pretend to abide by them, especially because the shogun has taken away all of their weapons. Here's the thing. Ordinances are abundant, but there is no actual constitution to the shogunate. There is a criminal code, but it isn't posted anywhere because, in keeping with Confucianism,
The people should not be instructed as to what the law might be, but should be content to do what they were told.
Okay. Government inspectors and officials roam the land, appointed by the shogun or the daimyos, and essentially act as the country's policemen. Most people don't attempt to break the law, though, because if you go down, everyone you love is going to go down with you. There is a system of punishment in place that means the head of a family answers for its members. Groups of households answer for each individual household, and so on. So if you mess up, your whole family, or even your entire village, might be punished. So you're going to think twice before committing any crimes. The third social class is made up of skilled artisans and craftsmen, and the lowest class are merchants and traders. Those last are looked down upon because, apparently, they make their livelihoods off the products of other people's hard work. However, as the period goes on, they will become increasingly wealthy and influential. After all, in times of peace, what do people do? They buy things. While the nobility are draping themselves in silks, ones they bought from the merchants are raking in the coin. Thus, by the end of the Edo period, we'll see a situation not unlike that in Downton Abbey-era England, where the landowning nobility are growing poorer and the new money merchant class is growing richer. Who's judging who now, son? This extremely rigid class system is good at creating boxes and making sure that everyone knows their place. But there are some people in Japan who don't fit neatly into any of them. The emperor and his courtiers, for one. Shinto and Buddhist priests, for another. Scholars, doctors, actors, and geishas. They all operate outside this class system. And we're going to take a good, close look at the geisha in a future episode. But for now, back to the emperor. While the shogun is ruling the country from Edo, the emperor is straight up chillin' in his palace in Kyoto. He spends most of his time practicing calligraphy, reading and writing poetry, and handling various ceremonial duties. Not a bad gig if you can swing it. Even though the shogun monitors all of his activities and gives him land for income, the emperor is still greatly respected. This respect stems from the fact that he is the head of the Shinto religion and is recognized as the direct descendant of the sun goddess, Amaterasu. That's right, the sun goddess, who we will soon meet in a bonus episode over on Patreon. Buddhism and Confucianism are widely practiced in Edo Japan, but Shinto is Japan's native religion. While Buddhism and Confucianism originated in India and China, respectively, and spread throughout East Asia, Shinto originated in Japan, and it largely stayed there. All three religions are practiced side by side, as they are complementary, and Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples dot the landscape. What is Shinto? It literally means way of the gods, and it revolves around the Japanese land, its seasons, and the relationship between nature and the people. There is no Shinto without Japan, and no Japan without Shinto. The main belief is that all natural things, trees, rocks, rivers, you name it, are inhabited by kami, a catch-all term for divine animalistic spirits, gods and goddesses, some of whom are thought to have created the Japanese islands themselves, and the spirits of deceased ancestors. While the Shinto pantheon does have gods, rites, shrines, and a mythology, it does not have a moral code, religious scripture, or a conception of a life after death. Most of its rituals focus on life in the present, celebrate nature and the changing of the seasons, and emphasize praying to kami, who are neither good nor bad and are capable of both benevolence and destruction. One of the biggest themes of Shinto is the idea of purification against pollution, such as blood, decay, and death. Many of the rituals and talismans have to do with purification, as it's believed the kami will only appear in conditions of extreme purity. Now, given that blood is considered one of the most polluting substances, guess who's considered unclean and impure by Shinto priests? Women! Because of the blood that accompanies menstruation and childbirth, women are associated with pollution, which apparently justifies discriminating against them. Women are often banned from uber-sacred mountains and temples due to this so-called impurity. Confucian doctrine encourages the subjugation of women, and Buddhist sects at the time claim women are incapable of attaining enlightenment without first being reborn as a man. If you are a Japanese woman in the Edo period hoping to be a priest, you are fresh out of luck, babe. In fact, women won't be allowed to become Shinto priests until 1945, and only really because all the religious guys leave to fight a war. But there are a few ways in which Japanese women can participate in religion under the Tokugawas. The first way is by serving as a miko, or shrine maiden. Miko are usually young women trained from the ages of 7 to 15 who act as attendants to priests and perform ceremonial duties during shrine rituals. They are often called upon to purify family hearths of evil spirits in a sort of exorcism involving a 5-colored Shinto wand. Wave that wand, girl! They also perform music at festivals, offer prayers, and distribute picture horse talismans, illustrated plaques of horses meant as pleas for help or tokens of gratitude, or blue robe talismans, holy strips of paper meant to prevent fires by invoking protection prayers to the god of the hearth. There are also female shamans, usually 30 years of age or older, called kami-sama or fujo. These women claim to have gained the ability to channel kami, or divine spirits, usually after battling a long illness or overcoming a serious trauma. So in some ways, this isn't all that different from all those 19th century female spiritual mediums we met way back in Season 1. The kami-sama make their living acting as mediums for the peasantry, which often includes offering divination, reading oracles, and curing illnesses caused by evil kami by performing exorcisms. Another very exclusive sect of shaman is called the ogami-sama or itaco. These female shamans are blind. You can't become an itaco if you have your eyesight, even if you can channel spirits. It's thought this state of being heightens the itaco's connection to the spirit world, and the itaco can call on divine spirits and the spirits of both the living and the dead, or hotoke. One itaco explained the difference between the two like this.
Thanks to the kami, my body has become strong. When the kami comes over me, it is like being in a dream. The heart feels light. A sick person makes my own body sick. That is true. The sickness appears in my body. In the case where a hotoke comes, I feel terribly sleepy. A kami is easier, you see, because possession is basically the way of the kami and not that of the hotoke. It is easier with the kami.
Most itaco begin their apprenticeships at the age of 10 or even earlier, as it's thought best to begin before a girl starts menstruating. Because, purity and stuff. For about 5 years, the apprentice memorizes ritual texts, practices aesthetic exercises, and does chores for her master, who is training her for the all-important kami-suke. The kami-suke is the itaco initiation ritual in which a kami attaches itself to the apprentice, and she is reborn as a fujo. Although anyone can claim to be a kami-sama and call the spirits, you can't become an itaco without completing the kami-suke ritual. This ritual involves moving into a small hut beside a well or creek and performing prayers there for 100 days. Woo! This is followed by a series of fasting exercises and cold water cleansing ablutions 3 times a day. During this entire ritual period, the apprentice is confined to her hut, must avoid being seen by other people, and also must avoid the sun and any other kind of pollution. This extreme isolation is meant to ensure that she will be purified enough to attract a kami. I think it sounds like a recipe for a serious case of cabin fever. After this isolation period is over, masters, apprentices, relatives, and neighbors are all invited to a public ceremony. The apprentice wears a white garment, white leggings, and white tabi, or traditional sock-shoe situations, and wraps her head with a white cloth, mimicking the attire of a corpse. She enters the house of her master, kneels before an altar, and a series of rites are performed. The room is purified with a wand of white paper streamers. Invocations are sung, and the kami are invited to join with the music. I'm imagining that, by now, this lady must be craving a snack. This goes on for hours, until eventually a kami comes to attach itself to the newly reborn itaco. The itaco speaks the name of her possessing spirit out loud, and then she loses consciousness. When she wakes, she is tested to determine whether she is now able to call forth a hotoke, or spirit of a dead person. No pressure! If she passes, she is honored with a celebration the next day, in which she's dressed like a bride and given a proper wedding feast. She's now considered essentially the bride of the kami possessing her, and it's viewed as a divine marriage. The itaco will serve her master for a few years before leaving and beginning her work as an independent itaco, performing exorcisms and seances, much like her shamanic sisters. All these female shamans are viewed as outcasts by society, and although the shogun has an official monitoring their comings and goings, they are still viewed with suspicion by Buddhist priests and the samurai. Frankly, I think they're a little bit jealous. Perhaps they don't like that most of these women travel alone to rural villages, making their living by serving the religious needs of the peasantry in a more empathetic way than that of the stuffy male priests. These women, and their independence, are so suspect that when the Tokugawa shogunate eventually falls, the new Meiji government will immediately ban the activities of all female shamans, who are forced to operate in secret outside the law. Because if there's one thing history has taught us, listeners, it's that men do not take kindly to women who have magical powers. That's it for now. Next episode, we'll pour out some tea and dive properly into the life of the ladies. We'll learn more about the Japanese household, gender roles, marriage, and rules about our etiquette and behavior. Until next time. Thanks for listening. If you like the Exploress, tell a friend about it, leave a review wherever you listen, become a patron of the show, or just shoot me a message on Instagram or an email via my website. Hearing from you always delights me. Much love to Carly Quinn for her help researching and writing this episode. You can find show notes and some great images at my website, theexploresspodcast.com, and a full transcript over on my Patreon. You can also find me on Instagram at the Exploress Podcast. Huge thanks to Josh Stackhouse for my theme music, Mr. Exploress for my logo, and to the following for their vocal stylings: May Kay and Theo Akimaru.